Music on Naatak Radio. W. Jacobs. Monkey's Paw. A spooky short story. Performed by Kartic Bharghav. Sound design by Navi Viswanathan. Be careful what you wish for.
Outside, the night was cold and wet, but a fire burned brightly in the small living room of the Kurien residence in East Lansing, Michigan. Mr. Kurien and his son Jitin were playing chess, while Mrs. Kurien, a grey-haired old lady, sat knitting by the fire, occasionally commenting on the game. "Listen to that wind howling outside," said Mr. Kurien. He had made a serious mistake and wanted to distract his son's attention so that he wouldn't see it. "I'm listening," said his son, concentrating on the chessboard. "Check." "I don't think Kazim will be able to make it today. Not in a storm like this," said the father, moving his piece in retaliation. "Mate?" replied the son. "That is what I can't stand about living in this part of the town," Mr. Kurien shouted with unexpected anger. "Of all the isolated places, this is the worst. Every time it rains, the road gets flooded and no one can get here. And what do those officials do about it? Nothing. They don't care because only 2 houses on this entire road are occupied." "Don't worry. Maybe you'll win the next game," said his wife. Mr. Kurien looked up sharply and saw mother and son smiling at him in amusement. He hid a guilty smile in his thin grey beard. "Sounds like he made it after all," said Jitin. The old man stood up hurriedly and went to open the door. Outside stood a tall, well-built man who had small, bright eyes and a red face. "My dearest Kazim, and should I too be adding the Padma Shri salutation now?" laughed Mr. Kurien as he introduced the acclaimed wildlife photographer to his family. The longtime friend shook hands, sat by the fire, and watched contentedly as Mr. Kurien got out some whiskey and glasses. After 3 drinks, the visitor's eyes became brighter and he began to talk. "So happy you could make it in this storm," said Mrs. Kurien. "Storm? This little shower?" chuckled Mr. Kazim. "You wouldn't think much of this if you were holed up in Shillong during the monsoon season." 17 years he has been gone. When I met him, he wasn't a day older than our Jitu here. And neither was I, for that matter. We started out in the warehouse together, just a few months after I moved here to the US, said Mr. Kurien to his wife and son. The family listened with great interest to the traveler while he spoke of his experiences of rainforests, marshlands, and strange encounters in unknown territories. He then moved on to describe his formidable expeditions in the Himalayas. "Oh, I'd love to go on a backpacking trip to the Himalayas," piped up Jitin. "And also visit old temples on the way and maybe even catch one of those holy men performing miracles." "You're much better off here," said Mr. Kazim, shaking his head. He put down his empty glass, sighed, and shook his head again. "But you must have all sorts of great stories to tell. The places you saw, the people you met." "Oh, I am sure he has many," said Mr. Kurien. "What was that story you started telling me the other day, Kazim? About a monkey's paw or something?" "Nothing," said Mr. Kazim quickly. "Nothing worth hearing anyway." "A monkey's paw?" "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, I suppose," said the photographer casually. Now the 3 listeners were looking at him eagerly. Mr. Kurien filled his glass for him. "It just looks like an ordinary little hand all dried up," said Mr. Kazim, as he fumbled in his pocket before eventually pulling it out. Mrs. Kurien moved back at once with a disgusted look, but her son examined it curiously. "And what is so special about it?" asked Mr. Kurien as he took the paw from his son and inspected it before putting it on the table. "An old fakir put a spell on it. He was a very holy man and he wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives. And that to interfere with fate only caused deep sadness. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His tone was so serious that the others realized that their careless laughter was not appropriate. "Well, why don't you wish on it then?" questioned Jitin. "I have," replied the visitor, going pale. "And did your 3 wishes really come true?" "Yes." "And has anyone else wished on it?" "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes. I do not know what the first 2 wishes were, but the third was for death. That is how I got the power." He spoke so seriously that everybody became quiet. "If you've had your 3 wishes, that thing is no good to you now," said Mr. Kurien at last. "Then Kazim, what do you keep it for?" The visitor shook his head and said slowly, "Oh, just for interest, I suppose. I was considering selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough trouble already. Anyway, no one is going to buy it. Some think it is all a fairy tale, and those who believe it want to try it before paying me." "If you had another 3 wishes, would you use them?" asked Jitin, looking interestedly at him. I don't know. Then Mr. Kazim took the paw and suddenly threw it in the fire. With an astonished cry, Mr. Kurien bent down and pulled it out quickly. "Better let it burn." "If you don't want it, give it to me, Kazim." "No, Kurian, I won't. That is why I threw it in the fire. Be sensible and throw it back." "Well, if you keep it, don't blame me for what happens." But examining his new possession closely, Mr. Kurian shook his head. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish loudly. But I warn you of the consequences." "It all sounds like the Arabian Nights," Mrs. Kurian said as she began to serve dinner. "Why don't you wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Laughing, her husband took the talisman from his pocket to make the wish, but with a look of alarm, his old friend caught his arm. "If you must wish, for heaven's sake, wish for something sensible. But I don't want to be here to see it." So Mr. Kurian put it back in his pocket and they all sat down for dinner. The talisman was partly forgotten for the rest of the evening, as the photographer continued telling them about his exciting adventures across the seas. After he left, Mr. Kurian said the story of the monkey's paw was probably not true, like all the other stories that Kazim had told them. "Did you give him anything for it?" Mrs. Kurian asked him. "Oh, just some money. He staunchly refused, but I made him take it. And he tried to persuade me again to throw the thing away." "Oh yes, why not? Let's throw it away. And give up our chances to be rich and famous and happy? To begin with, wish that you become King Acha. Maybe then at least, Ma cannot order you around." Mrs. Kurian pretended to be angry at this and chased him around the table, while Mr. Kurian looked at the paw doubtfully. "I do not know what to wish for, and that is a fact. It seems to me that I've got all what I want. If you could finish paying for the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" Jitin said. "Wish for $10,000 then. That'll just do it." His father, in an embarrassed way, held up the talisman as Jitin, with a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and played a few solemn notes. "I wish for $10,000, said the old man distinctly. As Jitin played a loud, dramatic chord, the old man suddenly cried out in a trembling voice. His wife and son ran towards him. "It moved!" he cried, glancing with disgust at the object on the floor. "When I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said Jitin, picking it up. "And I'm sure I never will." "Must have been your imagination," said Mrs. Kurien, looking anxiously at her husband. He shook his head. "No, look, one of its fingers is curled down now." His wife and Jitin insisted that the finger had always been down, but the old man strongly disagreed. "Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. Nobody's hurt, but it did give me a shock." An unusual and depressing silence fell on the family as they sat down again by the fire. The wind outside blew harder than ever, and the old man began to feel uneasy, as though he had just invited something into his life, something that did not belong there. "I don't know why we listen to all that nonsense. How could wishes be granted in real life?" Qasim mentioned things happen so naturally that you might think it was a coincidence. "Oh, right. Like, for example, it could drop on your head from the sky." "Enough of magic and fate for one night. Time for bed," said Mrs. Kurien as she stood up. "Acha, make sure to leave your bedroom door unlocked. You'll probably find a bag full of money next to you when you wake up," Jitin joked as he said goodnight to them. Mr. Kurien now sat alone in the darkness, looking absently into the fire and seeing faces in it. One face was so horrible and monkey-like, with a sinister smile. He stared at it in amazement. When he realized that he was still holding the monkey's paw, he quickly put it down. With a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and then went up to bed. In the morning, Jitin laughed at their fears. "It's all nonsense. Besides, even if you get the 10,000, how can it hurt you?" After Jitin went to work, Mr. and Mrs. Kurien continued to talk about the monkey's paw, as well as about Qasim's other stories and his drinking habits. The sun shone through the room, which looked very ordinary now, and the dirty, dried-up little paw was still lying where Mr. Kurien had thrown it carelessly. Suddenly, Mrs. Kurien stopped talking. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside in the street, who seemed to be trying to decide whether to open the gate and enter. She noticed that the stranger was well-dressed and immediately thought of the $10,000. 3 times he paused at the gate and walked away. The 4th time he stopped and put his hand on the gate, then suddenly opened it and walked up to the door and knocked. Mrs. Kurien opened the front door and brought the stranger inside. He seemed worried and uneasy and looked at her from the corner of his eye. I was asked to come here in person. I am from Generic Motors." The old lady looked surprised. "Is anything wrong? Has something happened to Jitin? What is it? What happened?" "I'm sorry." "Is he hurt?" "Badly hurt, but he is no longer in any pain." "Oh, thank God for that." But the sinister meaning of this assurance slowly dawned on the old lady, and she stared at the stranger in growing horror. He looked at the floor, avoiding her gaze, confirming her worst fears. She caught her breath and put her trembling hand on her husband's. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery of the automobile assembly line. The company asked me to inform you and express their sympathy. There was no response. The old woman's face was pale and the old man looked sick. I am to also tell you that Generic Motors does not hold themselves responsible for what has happened. But in consideration of your son's services, they wish to give a certain amount of money as compensation. Dropping his wife's hand, Mr. Kuriens stood up and stared at the man with a look of horror. "How much?" he asked. "Not as much as your son deserved. $10,000. Mrs. Kuriens screamed, but the old man did not hear her. He had fallen senseless to the floor. And as he lost consciousness, he saw a simian face with a grim smile looking at him. Having buried their son in a huge new cemetery 2 miles away, the old couple came back to a house full of shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they hardly realized it. They expected something else to happen, something that would lift the intolerable weight from their old hearts. But the days passed and their expectation changed to resignation. They hardly talked. They had nothing to talk about now. And their days were long and empty. It was about a week later that the old man woke up suddenly in the night and heard the sound of quiet crying coming from the window. He sat up and listened. "Come back to bed," he said tenderly. "You'll get cold." "It's colder for my son," said his wife, who continued weeping. The sound of it gradually faded as the old man fell asleep again, until a sudden wild cry from his wife woke him up with a start. "The paw! The monkey's paw!" "What? Where? Where is it? What is the matter?" "I just remembered it. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Why, what? I don't understand." "The other 2 wishes. You used only one. Go down and get the paw and wish our boy alive again." "Please come back to bed. You don't know what you're saying." "Our first wish was granted. Why not the second?" A coincidence." "Go and get it and wish." Mrs. Kurien was trembling with excitement. The old man did not like the idea, but his wife dragged him to the hallway. He went down to the living room and found the paw, but he could only think of his son's lifeless face. "He's been dead 10 days and besides..." "Bring him back." A cold sweat covered his face as he forced himself to pick the paw up. Suddenly he was possessed by a horrible fear that his unspoken wish might bring the ghost of his son back, even before he could escape from the room. "Wish!" The dirty, twisted, dried-up thing was now in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed different now. It was stark and expectant, and her expression seemed unnatural. He was afraid of her. "It's foolish and wicked. Wish." He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The paw fell to the floor. He looked at it in fear. There was no mistaking it this time. Another finger on the monkey's paw had curled down now. He then dropped weakly into a chair as his wife went to the window and stood looking out with burning eyes. As he closed his eyes, he could only think of the way his mutilated son had looked as he lay dead. He could barely recognize him then. Mr. Kuriens sat until he was chilled to the bone, glancing occasionally at his wife who was peering through the window. The candle flame which had burned low threw pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until it slowly went out. The old man, feeling an inexpressible relief that the wish had not worked, crept back into bed. A few minutes later, his wife also came to bed, silent and depressed.
What's that? A rat. A rat. It passed me on the stairs. It's Jitu. It's Jitu!
She screamed and ran to the bedroom door, but her husband was faster than her. He caught her by the arm and held her tightly. What are you going to do?
It's my boy. It's Jitu. I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door.
Mrs. Kuriens struggled to free herself. The knocking had now turned to pounding, which seemed odd to Mr. Kurien. Jitin had never done such a thing before when he was alive. He was usually very patient.
For God's sake, don't let that thing in. I didn't want to tell you this, but I could only recognize him by his clothes. He was mangled in the machinery. If he was too terrible for you to see, then how would it be now? Do you think I would fear my own son? Let me go. I'm coming, Jitu. I'm coming.
With a sudden violent movement, the old woman broke free and ran from the room. Mr. Kurien followed her to the top of the stairs and appealed her to stop as she hurried downstairs. He realized that he had wished his son alive, but not healed. Whatever was on the other side of the door wasn't their son. It was something monstrous, in indescribable pain, but unable to die. Then Mrs. Kurien's voice came, strained and breathless.
The bolt at the top. I can't reach it. Come down.
But Mr. Kurien was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor, trying to find the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. Mrs. Kurien had managed to push a chair across the floor now and set it against the door. With effort, she tugged at the bolt, moving it slowly. Just then, Mr. Kurien found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his last wish. A cold wind rushed up the stairs and a loud, long wail of disappointment and misery broke from his wife. It gave him the courage to run to her side and then to the gate outside. There was nothing there. The street lamp opposite the house shone flickering on a quiet and deserted road. Inside the house, the monkey's paw now lay on the floor with its third finger curled down. Mr. Kurien had gotten his final wish.